The wind had been howling since before dawn, the kind that scrapes dust across the desert like it's trying to erase everything that ever lived there. A lone rider moved through that storm. His coat was heavy with sand, his hat pulled low, his horse stumbling with exhaustion. In his arms, wrapped in a thin blanket, was a crying baby. He'd been riding for hours, maybe days, he couldn't remember anymore. His lips were cracked, his throat raw. Every step of the horse sounded like the ticking of a clock counting down to despair. The child's weak wail kept him awake, kept him human. He wasn't sure why he'd taken the baby, only that he couldn't leave it behind. By the time he spotted the faint curl of smoke from a chimney, he was barely holding on. The small wooden cabin stood at the edge of the trees, weathered, half hidden from the world. He dismounted slowly, every movement stiff with fatigue, and climbed the creaking steps. The baby whimpered against his chest. He hesitated only once before knocking on the door. It opened after a moment, not wide, just enough for him to see her. An Apache woman stood there, framed by firelight from inside. Her eyes were deep, calm, and watchful. She didn't say a word. Her face was expressionless, but there was a weight behind it, the kind that comes from too much silence, too many goodbyes. For a moment, neither spoke. Only the storm filled the space between them. He cleared his throat, his voice barely a whisper. I'm looking for milk, he said. The baby, she hasn't eaten. Her gaze shifted to the bundle in his arms. The faintest flicker of pain crossed her face, quick, almost invisible. She stepped aside, motioning him in without a word. The cabin smelled of cedar smoke and herbs. A single lamp glowed on the table. He stepped inside awkwardly, feeling like he was trespassing on sacred ground. She closed the door behind him, shutting out the wind. When she reached for the child, he hesitated, just long enough to show that trust didn't come easy. But she took the baby with a kind of practiced gentleness that made him lower his guard. The child quieted almost instantly in her arms. The cowboy sat down by the fire, rubbing his temples, his eyes stinging. He hadn't meant to cry, but exhaustion blurred the edges of everything. The woman didn't ask questions. She only worked in silence, tending to the child, adding wood to the fire, setting a pot of water to heat. Every movement was deliberate, graceful, unhurried. For the first time in days, warmth filled the room, not just from the fire, but from the strange, wordless understanding between two people who had nothing left but kindness. He looked up, ready to thank her, but the words never came. Because in that small, quiet cabin, as the storm raged outside, something shifted. A stranger's desperation had met a woman's mercy, and both their lives had just changed. The baby's cries filled the cabin, thin and broken at first, then fading into small gasps. The Apache woman cradled the child close, whispering softly in her language, words the cowboy couldn't understand but somehow felt. They carried comfort, the kind that came from a soul that had learned to calm storms greater than this one. He sat at the edge of the firelight, hat in his hands, watching her. Every motion she made was careful, steady hands, a patient rhythm. She didn't rush, didn't panic. The baby's tiny fingers gripped the woven fabric of her shawl, and in that touch, something inside the cowboy eased for the first time in days. He cleared his throat, his voice rough. She belonged to a woman I met on the trail, he said quietly. The mother didn't make it. I couldn't just leave the little one there. The woman didn't look up. Her face remained calm, though her eyes softened with an emotion he couldn't name. When the baby whimpered again, she turned slightly away, her back forming a shield between the child and the cold air leaking through the cracks of the cabin walls. The cowboy looked down at his hands. I ain't got much. No milk, no supplies. Just needed to keep her alive long enough to find help. The words hung in the space between them, a confession, maybe, or a plea. He expected judgment, or silence. Instead, there was a kind of stillness, deep and certain. Then she did something he hadn't expected. She shifted, wrapped the baby in her arms, and without a word, offered the kind of mercy that only a mother could. The cowboy turned his head away, bowing it low, not out of shame, but reverence. He could hear the baby's breathing steady, the faint hum of a lullaby mixing with the crackle of the fire. He didn't dare speak. He only listened. Outside, the wind beat against the wooden walls, but inside, the world had gone gentle. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time didn't matter. The woman rocked the child until sleep came, then laid her down in a basket near the fire. Her movements were graceful, practiced, almost ceremonial. When she finally straightened, the cowboy rose instinctively, as if afraid to disturb the peace she had created. She turned to him then. Her gaze met his, not shy, not bold, just steady. There was strength there, but also the faint shimmer of sorrow. "Rest," she said quietly, her accent wrapping the word in warmth. He nodded, removing his coat, feeling the weight of days of dust and heartbreak leave his shoulders. He sat back down, eyes on the fire, and exhaled a breath that had been stuck in his chest since the storm began. The child slept. The woman stood guard. The cowboy watched her silhouette flicker in the firelight, a silent guardian born of grace and loss. And in that still moment, he understood something simple and unspoken: sometimes, mercy doesn't arrive with words or promises. Sometimes, it just opens a door, and lets you in. By morning, the storm had wandered off into the hills, leaving behind a world washed clean. The light that crept through the small cabin window was soft and golden, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. Inside, everything was still. The baby slept soundly in a basket beside the fire, tiny chest rising and falling under the warmth of a quilt. The cowboy sat nearby, elbows on his knees, staring into the flames as if the whole night had been a dream. His coat hung by the hearth, drying. His hands trembled slightly, not from cold now, but from the strange peace settling in his bones. He turned his head to the woman. She was sitting by the far wall, braiding her long dark hair. Her face looked different in the daylight, softer, younger somehow, though her eyes still held a quiet sadness that years couldn't erase. When she noticed him watching, she didn't look away. For a long second, they just regarded one another, two people bound by chance, carrying ghosts neither dared to name. He cleared his throat. "Didn't think we'd see daylight again," he said, voice low, almost shy. She gave a small nod. "Storm is gone," she replied. "But another will come." Her tone wasn't fearful, just matter of fact, the voice of someone who'd seen too much to believe in lasting calm. The cowboy smiled faintly. "You always talk like that." She shrugged, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Like what?" "Like you already know how the story ends." Her eyes met his again, dark, steady, unreadable. "Maybe I do," she said softly. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was full, the kind that hums quietly between two people who understand that words can ruin what's sacred. He leaned back against the wall, letting his shoulders drop, listening to the faint crackle of the fire and the soft hum of her voice as she began to sing again, the same low lullaby from the night before. He didn't know the words, but he didn't need to. The melody carried something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace, belonging, maybe even grace. The baby stirred, then settled again, lulled by the rhythm of her voice. The cowboy's gaze lingered on her hands, strong, capable hands that had seen both labor and loss. He wondered who she'd sung for before. A child of her own. A husband. A memory she never spoke aloud. The thought stirred something in him, not pity, not even desire, just a deep, aching respect. When the song ended, he spoke again, quietly. "You got a name?" She hesitated for a breath. "Nayeli," she said. "It means, I love you." He nodded slowly, a small smile finding its way to his face. "Fitting," he murmured. Outside, the valley began to glow under the rising sun. The birds returned, the wind gentled. Inside that small cabin, a fragile trust had taken its first breath, not loud or certain, but real. And as the cowboy watched the Apache woman move about her home, he realized something had shifted inside him too. He wasn't just passing through anymore. Something, or someone, had made him stay. Days began to settle into a rhythm, slow, simple, and strangely steady. The storm had left the land softer, the air clearer. Each morning, the cowboy stepped outside to fetch water from the creek while the Apache woman tended the baby and the fire. Their words were few, but their silences grew easier, familiar in a way neither expected. He'd never lived like this before, without hurry, without noise. Out there in the open fields, a man usually measured time by miles and sunlight. But here, inside this small wooden cabin, time moved by heartbeats and the quiet sounds of life returning, the baby's small sighs, the clatter of a wooden spoon, the crackle of kindling being set alight. Sometimes she caught him watching her, not with hunger or boldness, but with a kind of quiet wonder. She didn't shy from his gaze, though she rarely returned it for long. She'd learned, long ago, that too much looking can make a moment fragile. They worked side by side, him chopping wood, her mending blankets, their movements wordlessly in tune. When she offered him food, her hands brushed his once, and that single touch sent a warmth through him deeper than fire could reach. He didn't say a word, but his eyes softened. She noticed. In the evenings, when the sky turned rose-colored over the mountains, they would sit outside the cabin. The baby rested on her lap, half asleep. The cowboy would tell small stories, about his ranch, about the horse that never let anyone else ride him, about the wide-open plains where a man could lose himself and never be found again. His voice carried both pride and ache. She listened quietly, sometimes smiling, sometimes looking away toward the horizon. When she did speak, her words were spare, but they carried meaning. She told him about the land, the flowers that grew after rain, the coyotes that sang to the moon, the spirits she believed still walked among the trees. Her stories were slower, older, full of the kind of truth that doesn't need proof. He found himself drawn to that stillness in her, to the way she could hold both strength and sadness without either breaking her. One night, as the firelight danced across the walls, the baby gripped his finger tightly. He froze, looking at that tiny hand wrapped around his rough skin. She smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her, and for a heartbeat, the world went utterly quiet. "I think she knows you," Nayeli said softly. He looked at her, startled by the gentleness in her voice. "Maybe she knows kindness when she feels it," he answered. Their eyes held a moment too long, not with boldness, but with recognition. Something unnamed began to grow there, slow and sure, like spring grass pushing through dry ground. When they turned away, neither spoke again that night. But both felt it, the closeness that had crept in quietly, like dawn through a crack in the wall. Two souls, from worlds apart, had begun to share one small rhythm, one that no storm could undo. The evening began quietly, like most evenings did now, with the sound of the wind brushing the cabin walls and the soft crackle of the fire. The cowboy was carving a small wooden toy with his knife, shaping it into something that might make the baby laugh. Nayeli was stirring a pot of soup, her movements calm and steady. The baby lay near the fire, wrapped in content. But as the night deepened, the peace broke. A thin, high cry filled the room. At first it was small, a whimper, but soon it grew sharper, desperate. The baby's forehead was hot, her cheeks flushed. Nayeli touched her, then looked up at him with alarm that barely cracked her calm. "She burns," she whispered. The cowboy felt his stomach drop. He knelt beside them, panic flashing in his eyes. "What do we do?" Nayeli was already moving, wet cloth, cool water, herbs crushed between her palms. She spoke softly to the child, murmuring words from her own tongue. The baby's cries echoed off the walls. The cowboy held her small hand, helpless, feeling his chest tighten with fear he hadn't felt even on the hardest trails. Hours passed in a blur. The fire burned low. The cabin filled with shadows and the smell of damp cloth and smoke. Nayeli's hands never stopped working, cooling, soothing, singing under her breath. The cowboy followed her lead, fetching water, keeping the fire alive. Neither rested. At some point, when the fever broke, the child went quiet. Not silent in fear, but in peace, her breathing even, her skin cool. Nayeli let out a shaky sigh and leaned back against the wall. For the first time since he'd met her, her strength seemed to falter. The cowboy sat beside her, exhausted, his shoulders slumping. His hand brushed hers as he reached for the basin. They didn't move away. The air was thick with relief, the kind that makes you realize how close you came to losing something precious. "She'll be fine now," Nayeli said softly, her voice trembling from fatigue. He nodded, staring at the sleeping baby. "You saved her." She shook her head. "No. We did." The firelight flickered across her face, sweat-damp hair against her temple, dark eyes tired but shining. And then, for the first time, she smiled. Not a small polite smile, but one that reached her eyes, soft, unguarded, alive. It hit him harder than any storm ever had. That smile carried every unspoken thing between them, gratitude, respect, and something tender neither dared name. He smiled back, quietly, afraid to break whatever this was. Their shoulders rested against each other, just enough to share warmth. No words followed. None were needed. Outside, the moon climbed high over the pines, bathing the cabin in silver light. Inside, two weary souls sat side by side, watching the child they'd saved sleep safely between them. The night felt endless, but in that stillness, something deeper than survival had taken root. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But for now, he knew one truth. When she smiled, the world finally felt safe again. The days that followed were gentle, but heavy with something neither of them could name. The fever had left the baby weak but smiling, her tiny hand reaching for the light every morning. The cabin no longer felt like a place of survival, it had become something softer. A home, almost. The cowboy felt it every time he stepped outside, the smell of pine, the smoke curling up from the chimney, the faint sound of Nayeli humming inside. But the world beyond still called to him. He had a horse waiting, a life unfinished, debts and ghosts scattered across the plains. He knew he couldn't stay here forever. One afternoon, he saddled his horse and stood by the fence he'd been mending. The wood creaked under his hand. He watched the sun dip low behind the ridgeline, turning the valley to gold. The thought of leaving hit him harder than he'd expected. Inside, Nayeli was rocking the baby near the window. She looked peaceful, but her eyes followed him, calm on the surface, guarded underneath. She could feel the restlessness in him, the quiet pull of the road. That night, he sat by the fire, staring into the flames. "You've done more for me than I can ever repay," he said softly. "But I can't keep staying here. The baby, she needs more than I can give." Nayeli said nothing for a while. She just kept her gaze on the child in her arms. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, too steady. "She knows my voice now. My hands. My smell." She looked up at him. "If you take her away, she will cry for me. If you leave her, she will cry for you." Her words hit like truth always does, quiet, unflinching, unavoidable. He rubbed a hand over his face, sighing deeply. "I don't belong here," he said. "This ain't my world." She tilted her head slightly. "Then where is your world?" He had no answer. Not anymore. The towns had grown colder. The road had taken too much. He looked at the woman across from him, strong, still, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, and felt something he hadn't let himself feel in years, peace, fragile but real. The baby stirred, cooing softly. Nayeli looked down, her expression softening. The cowboy's eyes followed her, mother and child wrapped in golden firelight. His heart pulled toward them, fierce and helpless all at once. He rose slowly, stepping closer. "Maybe I don't know where I belong," he said, voice low, "but maybe it ain't out there anymore." For a moment, neither moved. The air between them felt alive, filled with everything they hadn't dared to say. Then the baby reached out, one tiny hand grasping his finger, the other touching her mother's. The three of them frozen in that fragile triangle of connection. The fire popped, and outside the wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain. Maybe, he thought, this was what home really felt like, not a place to run to or from, but two souls choosing to stay when every reason said to go. Spring came to the valley like a long-forgotten promise. The air softened, the trees bloomed, and the ground that once cracked under drought now shimmered with new grass. For the first time in months, the sound of laughter echoed near the cabin, the kind that came from something small, pure, and alive. The cowboy was in the yard, mending the fence again. But this time, his hands worked without the restlessness that used to live in them. He had nowhere else to be, and for the first time, that felt right. Nayeli stood near the doorway, the baby on her hip. The child's tiny fingers tugged gently at her braid, giggling when she made faces. The cowboy looked up, smiling as he leaned on the fence post. "She's got lungs," he said. "She has your stubbornness," Nayeli replied, the corners of her mouth lifting. He chuckled, walking toward them, brushing the dust from his hands. "Guess that makes two of you." She rolled her eyes, but the teasing carried no edge. There was an ease between them now, the kind that grows only after shared storms. He reached out to the baby, who reached back without hesitation. The warmth of that small body against his chest brought a stillness that words couldn't hold. He glanced at Nayeli. "You think she remembers all we've been through?" Nayeli's gaze softened. "She will not remember," she said quietly. "But she will feel it, here." She placed her hand gently on his chest, over his heart. The touch was brief, but it lingered, grounding, warm, wordless. He covered her hand with his for a moment, eyes searching hers. There was no need for declarations or promises. The truth was already there, living in the quiet between their breaths. Days turned into weeks. The cowboy repaired the roof, planted a small garden, and built a cradle by hand. Nayeli gathered herbs and taught him the names of the flowers in her tongue. At night, they sat outside as the baby slept, sharing stories under the stars, his of roads and regrets, hers of spirits and beginnings. Sometimes they didn't speak at all. Sometimes, silence was enough. One evening, as the sun melted behind the mountains, he turned to her and said softly, "I used to think I was just passing through this world, no home, no name that mattered. But now," he paused, searching the horizon, then her face. "Now I reckon I've been found." She didn't answer with words. She simply smiled, that same gentle smile he'd seen the night the fever broke, and leaned her head against his shoulder. The baby stirred in the cradle nearby, sighing in her sleep. The sound was small, but it filled the whole valley. The cowboy exhaled slowly, closing his eyes. For the first time, he wasn't waiting for morning or worrying about leaving. The road behind him had gone quiet. The one ahead no longer called. All that remained was this, a cabin lit by fading gold, the laughter of a child, and the quiet strength of a woman who'd given him back his heart. Out here, far from the noise of the world, they hadn't just survived. They'd built a home, not from wood or stone, but from mercy, loss, and love that asked for nothing in return.